Well, I think China. China has done quite a remarkable job. It has been one of the leaders in investing around 7 to 8% of its GDP in the types of infrastructure that we deal with in this report. And they have they've been able to produce much more electricity for their factories, for their homes. They've been able to do a lot of expressways connecting cities, rail. So across the board, we see China has invested quite a bit. Typically in Asia, it's the public sector. So it's the central government, but also state-owned enterprises. So for example, if you look at the case of China, it's really state-owned enterprises playing a very, very important role in infrastructure investments. If you look at a country like India, the central government and state-owned enterprises are important, but also about a third or so of investments in recent years has been coming from the private sector. So the exact mix varies by countries, but everywhere the public sector, including state-owned enterprises, tends to be the major player in infrastructure investments.
I would like to talk more about the China infrastructure as well, like the stage of the development of the infrastructure right now. Do you think it's good enough, or does the country tend to develop further in any particular way?
You're asking about the case of China. Now, China has invested a lot, and in fact, it still has a long way to go. Because if we compare infrastructure needs from the perspective of how much average citizen in, let's say, an OECD country enjoys in terms of infrastructure services, even China, which has done very well, has a long way to go. So for example, we find that whether it's access to roads or even access to electricity, certainly access to piped water, we find that in each of these cases, even China, which is a leader in the developing Asia, still has some ways to go before it catches up with OECD levels.
Is it effective as well, like the investment value that they put on?
Yes. Sometimes it takes some time for infrastructure investments to pay off. So for example, if you build a highway, now immediately you may not see next year the highway being used a lot, but over a medium term, over 3 years, 5 years, you might find that the highway is being used a lot. So sometimes with infrastructure, it's a question of waiting a short amount of time and then seeing it being used.
Okay, we've already talked about the leader in terms of like infrastructure in Asia, but the opposite side as well, like which country or region you think that need to speed up in terms of like improving or developing the infrastructure?
Yes. So there are two regions that do come out as needing to focus more on infrastructure investments. One is the Pacific Islands. For the Pacific Island economies, one of their special problems, of course, has to do with climate change. Climate change is bringing some challenges, and building infrastructure that's resilient to climate shocks can be quite high. Certainly in the case of the Pacific Islands, that's an issue they need to watch out for. But also some economies in South Asia and Central West Asia, they do need to invest more. So whether it's Bangladesh or India or Pakistan, these are countries where there still is quite a bit of a need to step up infrastructure investments.
And in which type of infrastructure, like specifically?
Well, the two very expensive sectors for infrastructure are always some combination of transport and the energy sector. So these are really the two sectors that form the bulk of the infrastructure needs in those countries.
Is funding or like trying to find money to invest in infrastructure, is it like one of the most important obstacles now, do you think?
Actually, that's a very interesting question. The funds are there. If you look at Asia as a whole, or even Asia without China, the countries in the region, they save a lot. So there are domestic resources. The challenge is to take those resources and bring them into the infrastructure sector. Now, quite naturally, the average household or the private sector does not want to invest in infrastructure because infrastructure is a very long-lived asset. So it's a complicated asset, but there the challenge is really for the government to ensure that an enabling environment is there, that the rules for investing in infrastructure and then drawing the returns are very clear. And in our report, we make the point that if the public sector can get that regulatory environment correct, if they can improve and make that planning and coordination activities more efficient, the money will actually come in. The money, we believe, is there. The region has the resources.
Okay. Could I also ask, what is the ADB role in terms of helping countries in the Asia to develop the infrastructure?
So ADB plays two roles. One is, of course, a very well-known role, which is of bringing in finance.
Yes.
As you know, we lend and we lend for long-term development. So infrastructure is very important for ADB's lending. So around 70 to 80% of our lending is for infrastructure. Having said that, the needs of the region are huge. And so whether it's ADB or other multilateral development agencies, finance is only one element. Increasingly, multilateral development banks like ADB have a very important second role to play, which is helping countries develop that policy environment and the institutional environment to attract more finance. We also have a very important role in bringing in the technical expertise, understanding which is the best type of technology to use for a given problem, and helping countries just implement infrastructure projects using modern procurement methods and technical methods.
Do you have any estimation how much funding does the Asian country need in order to develop the infrastructure to be in a good enough level?
Yes, we estimate that over the next 15 years, the region as a whole will need about $1.7 trillion per year.
Okay.
If it is to meet its infrastructure needs, and also use that infrastructure investment to meet the climate goals. The key climate goal being ensuring that global temperatures don't rise by more than 2% as compared to pre-industrial levels, 2 degrees Celsius.
And how much do we have now at this rate?
Right now, if we consider a smaller set of 25 economies in the region, which includes China, India, Indonesia, the region is investing close to $900 billion a year.
Okay.
So it's quite
right?
it's a little bit more than halfway.
Okay.
But yes, approximately you're right. There's a lot of room to expand. It's a big challenge, but we think it can be done.
Okay.
And what we would really like to use this report to focus on is the needed policy changes. So, for example, in the public sector side, there are a set of public finance reforms that can be undertaken. So in a number of economies, including Thailand, the debt levels are moderate. So there is actually scope for expanding borrowings in a prudentially sound manner, and to use those to invest in infrastructure and other needed things like education, healthcare, etc. In a number of countries, we also find that there is a space to expand on revenues. For example, improving tax administration by using maybe more property taxes, etc. So there's scope for the public sector to increase its finance, and there's scope to bring in the private sector. But as I'd mentioned earlier, bringing in the private sector really requires the right policy and institutional framework. So having a PPP law, a law for public-private partnerships, then having well spelled out dispute resolution mechanisms, because the infrastructure sector is a complicated one. There will be issues and problems. How do you resolve those problems? Can you resolve them fast and move on? So those things become quite important. It's very important also to build actually technical capacity, both in the private sector and the public sector, to be able to carry out very good detailed engineering designs so that you design your infrastructure projects using the best and appropriate technologies, and that you carry out your procurement and bidding processes carefully. So technical capacity is also quite important.